Under a sky heavy with secrets, Windsor Castle stood silent, as it always did in moments of transition. Its ancient stones, weathered by centuries of scandal and succession, now carried a new burden. A truth so explosive, it was deliberately hidden behind sealed envelopes, locked vaults, and whispered intentions. The corridors of the royal household had always echoed with formality, but on this particular morning, something felt different, eerily tense. For those close to the crown, the storm wasn't coming. It had arrived. Princess and stood alone in her late mother's private study. The scent of old wood and English lavender still clung to the drapes. The light streamed through narrow windows, landing on a polished desk where a sealed envelope sat. Not just any envelope. This one bore her name in Queen Elizabeth's careful, unmistakable handwriting. The letter, marked for delivery in the event of irreversible family conflict, had been hidden from everyone, even King Charles. Anne's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were 2 pieces of paper and 1 command. The truth was to be revealed only when the legacy of the monarchy faced erasure, or worse, reinvention. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What Anne read wasn't just a will. It was a parting shot, a calculated and deeply personal move by a monarch who spent her life balancing duty with emotion. And this, it seemed, was one final moment where emotion had won. The Queen had left no personal inheritance to Camilla, not even a trinket, not even a kind word. But to Princess Charlotte, the young daughter of Prince William and Kate Middleton, she had gifted something incalculably valuable, Diana's heirlooms. Not simply jewels, but a collection of personal letters, diaries, and historic accessories that had belonged to the people's princess. The symbolism was as clear as it was painful. The crown's matriarch had spoken, not through press releases or staged addresses, but with a legacy sealed in ink and silence. And it was Anne, the Queen's most stoic child, who now bore the weight of revealing it. This wasn't a decision made lightly. According to those closest to her, Anne had sat on the letter for months, agonizing over the consequences of making it public. But the moment finally came. A growing tension within the royal household, whispers of Camilla seeking to reshape public memory, talk of modernizing the monarchy's image away from Diana's lingering shadow. It was, in Anne's words, the moment her mother had predicted. The Queen had never fully embraced Camilla, despite what the public had been led to believe. While cordial in public and respectful in tradition, there were cracks in the polished image that even palace aides couldn't hide. Camilla had long been seen by some as a reminder of pain, scandal, and betrayal. For others, she was a symbol of second chances and love persevering. But for Queen Elizabeth, the matter was never that romantic. Her issue, as Anne would later reveal, was never with Camilla as a person. It was with what Camilla represented, the erasure of Diana. Behind closed doors, Queen Elizabeth reportedly struggled with the idea of Camilla as queen consort. She accepted it publicly when the tide of public opinion had shifted, but privately, she had her reservations, and she knew that Diana's image was not one to be replaced. She knew the public adored Diana in a way no other royal had ever been adored. And most importantly, she knew that her legacy, and that of the monarchy, could not afford to let Diana fade into footnotes. So she acted, quietly, strategically, as only the Queen could. She instructed her legal advisors to place a sealed codicil in her personal will, a section that would bypass the usual inheritance structure and go directly to a specific beneficiary. Princess Charlotte, the Queen, who rarely showed favoritism among her great-grandchildren, had seen something in Charlotte, a spark, a demeanor, a resemblance, that reminded her of the young Diana before the crown. She reportedly wrote, "Let her wear what Diana once wore. Let her feel the strength of a woman who walked into the fire for this family and walked out still loved." The news of this transfer was not supposed to be revealed immediately upon the Queen's death. She feared the monarchy was too fragile in its first months under King Charles. But she gave Anne the authority to release it when necessary. And now, it seemed, that moment had come. The room where the family gathered that day was not unfamiliar to any of them. It was the Queen's personal salon, where she met with heads of state, shared private teas, and made decisions that shaped the future of the Commonwealth. On this day, however, There were no diplomats, no press photographers, just family. Charles, Camilla, William, and a few senior advisors. The mood was unusually still, and, always the soldier of the family, spoke plainly. She produced the letter. She handed it to Charles first, who read it with a stony face. Then to William, who closed his eyes briefly when he finished. And finally, to Camilla. What happened next was something no one in the room expected. Camilla laughed. Not a joyous laugh, but a sharp, almost disbelieving chuckle, the kind that escapes when something cuts deeper than expected. She asked if this was a joke. No one answered. She turned to Charles, who remained silent, and went and confirmed the Queen's directive in front of the room. Camilla reportedly broke. Witnesses say she turned pale, then flushed with color. She stood up suddenly, muttered something under her breath, and left the room in tears. Those nearest heard her say, "She never truly accepted me, even in death." Later, Camilla was overheard confiding in a close aide, her voice trembling. "That woman has haunted me since the beginning, and now, even in her passing, she's still choosing Diana over me." The reaction inside the palace was mixed. Some sympathized with Camilla. After all, she had spent decades slowly rehabilitating her public image, finally winning over much of the press and public. She had shown grace, humor, and patience. But others, particularly those close to William, felt the Queen's decision was righteous. It wasn't about rejection, they said, but preservation. William's role in this unfolding drama cannot be overstated. He had known about the Queen's intention for some time. In fact, he was consulted in the final months of her life, during private meetings where she asked how best to protect Diana's memory in a world where the past is too easily rewritten. William reportedly told her, "My daughter deserves to carry a name and legacy untarnished. Let her wear what my mother once wore, not what Camilla replaced." He didn't push the Queen. He didn't ask for revenge. He simply asked for honor, and the Queen granted it. For Princess Charlotte, the weight of this moment may not yet be fully understood. But one day, when she opens the velvet-lined cases holding Diana's jewelry, or reads the private letters written by the mother her father loved and lost, she will feel it. She will know that history lives not just in books or palaces, but in the items passed down by those who refuse to let truth be buried. The Queen's final act wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. A symbolic gesture meant to preserve the woman who changed the monarchy forever. Not with rebellion, but with grace. Not with power, but with heart. And in the echo of that gesture, the royal family has been forced to confront something far deeper than inheritance. They've been forced to confront legacy. It began, as most stories of upheaval do, with a silence too loud to ignore. In the weeks following Queen Elizabeth II's passing, the palace had descended into a fragile calm, the kind of stillness that isn't peace, but a tense waiting. Mourning was still officially in effect, and the royal family, dressed in their polished public grief, went about their duties with the precision of a machine. Behind closed doors, however, a very different sort of energy was building. Rumors of hidden clauses in the Queen's private will had begun circulating among those close to the inner sanctum. Not the formal documents released for the public record, but the true will, the handwritten instructions and sealed directives left with her most trusted daughter, Princess Anne. Princess Anne had always been the Queen's loyal shadow. She understood the monarchy as more than just symbolism or power. It was survival, legacy, and resilience. So when the Queen, in her final months, entrusted and with a sealed envelope and a cryptic instruction, "Open this only when the monarchy forgets its heart," and took it seriously. She did not open the envelope when her mother died. She did not open it at the first council meeting, or during the state funeral, or even at the family's private wake. She waited, carrying the burden silently, aware that timing would be everything. But as time passed and whispers grew louder, as Camilla began asserting a more visible presence, reportedly seeking to reframe historical narratives about her role in the royal family, and knew the moment had arrived. It was an early morning at Balmoral Castle when she finally opened the envelope. She had chosen the location deliberately. Balmoral had always been Elizabeth's retreat from the theater of monarchy, a place where she was a woman first, a queen second, and sat alone in the library, the walls lined with hunting portraits, the fireplace unlit. She broke the seal, unfolded the yellowing paper, and began to read. The Queen's letter was short but surgically precise. No grand language. No florid farewells. Just a mother's final act of clarity. It read, "Diana's legacy must never be reshaped. The crown can be shared, but the heart cannot. The heirlooms are to go to Charlotte. She must carry forward what cannot be spoken anymore. Do not release this until necessary. You will know when." And read the letter twice before she even breathed. Then she unfolded the second page, a list of specific heirlooms. Diana's iconic sapphire engagement ring, a diamond-studded tiara gifted to her by the Queen herself before the wedding, and a collection of private letters penned by Diana during her most turbulent years in the palace. There were also 2 audio tapes, never released publicly, where Diana spoke candidly about her fears, her dreams for her sons, and her thoughts about what legacy really meant. The Queen's handwriting was steady throughout. It wasn't a deathbed scrawl. It was written with intention, likely composed months or even years before her death, and recognized the writing style. It matched the Queen's other private memos. There was no mistaking it, and there was no mistaking the intent either, and sat still for over an hour, holding the pages like they might disintegrate if she moved too quickly. Outside the library, the morning was beginning to stir. Birds chirped. A footman passed by the corridor. Life continued, but inside Anne's heart, something had shifted. She realized she had just become the gatekeeper of one of the most consequential secrets the monarchy had left. She was no stranger to royal politics. She had seen scandal, infighting, abdications, betrayals, and cover-ups. But this felt different. This wasn't about money, power, or scandal. This was about legacy, and about which woman the Queen had truly stood beside when history forced her to choose. And the Queen had chosen Diana. Quietly, elegantly, but unequivocally. The hardest part wasn't discovering it. The hardest part was what came next, telling the others, and knew the consequences would be seismic. Camilla had worked tirelessly over the years to transform her public image, from the other woman to a queen consort seen as gracious, warm, and supportive. But this letter had the power to unravel that carefully constructed narrative. Not because it attacked Camilla directly, it didn't, but because it made a deliberate omission. The Queen had chosen not to include her in her personal will, not even with a small gesture, and decided to tell no one at first. She traveled back to London under the guise of attending meetings with Commonwealth representatives. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept the letter hidden inside her personal briefcase, the same one she'd used during official overseas tours, locked beneath layers of old memos and briefing papers. She spent a week observing the family, watching Charles, watching Camilla. She noticed the subtle changes, Camilla's increasing influence over public messaging, her confident strolls beside the king, the way she began making comments about evolving the monarchy's feminine image, and had never liked palace theater. She preferred horses and action to speeches and charm. But even she couldn't ignore that something about the dynamic felt too orchestrated, too quick. Then came the line in one of Camilla's closed-door meetings with press advisors, which Anne heard about through a longtime staffer. "It's time we stop lingering in the shadow of Diana. That era is over." That was the moment, the one her mother had spoken of. The monarchy was forgetting its heart, and sent personal notes requesting a private family assembly at Clarence House, not through public scheduling channels, but by hand-delivered message. William accepted first, then Charles, then Camilla. She told them nothing in advance. When they arrived, she kept the mood formal but restrained. No servants were allowed in the room. No phones, just a tea tray, a folder, and a locked briefcase. And began not with emotion, but with duty. She reminded them of the Queen's last wishes to keep the institution stable, and how some wishes, though delayed, were meant to outlast strategy. Then she produced the letter. Slowly, carefully. Charles recognized the Queen's handwriting immediately. William sat forward in his chair. Camilla looked wary but said nothing, and read the letter aloud. The silence in the room afterward was devastating. Charles stared at the floor. William rubbed his hands together, nodding slightly. Camilla, frozen for a moment, blinked rapidly. Then she whispered, This wasn't included in the will," and responded, "Not the public will. This was her private codicil, her personal wish." Camilla asked if the Queen had ever said anything to her, and didn't respond. She didn't have to. The air changed. Camilla's lips tightened. She stood, her teacup still full. "I suppose I always knew," she said. "But I hoped, at least in death, I would be part of her peace." No one had the words to reply. Camilla left the room moments later. The door closed softly, but the message was thunderous, and had delivered the Queen's final wish. The silence that followed was not peace. It was reckoning. And knew, this was just the beginning. To the outside world, Diana's legacy was built on compassion, rebellion, and vulnerability. To the royal family, however, it was far more complicated. Her name still carried a paradox: revered and reviled, glorified and feared. But no matter how time passed, and no matter how many public appearances Camilla made or how many polished photos filled the Sunday tabloids, one truth remained unshaken: Diana was unforgettable. That truth had always unsettled the institution. The monarchy depends on continuity. It relies on narratives that are carefully curated and strictly controlled. Diana disrupted that. She didn't just live through the royal system. She exposed it, cracked it open with raw honesty. She made people feel what the palace had spent decades avoiding: emotion. And it was in those feelings, those public outpourings of grief and adoration, that Diana's true power settled, not in titles or protocols, but in people's hearts. So when Queen Elizabeth made the deliberate choice to place Diana's personal effects in the hands of Princess Charlotte, bypassing not only Camilla but other royal women as well, it wasn't a personal attack. It was a statement, a quiet, strategic maneuver to anchor Diana's memory where it could not be altered, within the hands of the future. Inside the Queen's letter to and was a detailed inventory of items. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a preservation of identity. Each piece selected for Charlotte had a story, a history soaked in both glamour and sorrow. The first was the iconic sapphire and diamond engagement ring, the very one Prince William had given to Catherine Middleton years earlier, which Catherine had since designated to pass to Charlotte in due time. But the Queen didn't stop at that. She instructed that Diana's Spencer tiara, famously worn during her wedding, be transferred into the private care of the Middleton family vault until Charlotte's coming of age. There were also brooches, handwritten letters, perfume bottles, and a hand-bound diary with floral embossing, never before seen by the public. The most haunting pieces, though, were the letters. Written between 1992 and 1996, they were private communications from Diana to Queen Elizabeth herself. The letters ranged from tearful confessions to stoic updates, and in some, Diana asked not for pity, but for acknowledgement. She wrote about her sons, about her isolation, about her fears for the future. In one letter, Diana had scribbled in the margins, "If I disappear from history, it won't be because I walked away. It will be because I was erased." That single line, according to insiders, stayed with Queen Elizabeth for years. There were also recordings, rare tapes Diana had dictated for her own memory, perhaps never meant to be heard. The Queen had kept 2 of them in her private safe, away from MI5 archives and royal historians. In one of the tapes, Diana's voice reportedly trembled as she described feeling like a prisoner in a palace of ghosts. "They talk about duty," she said. "But what is duty when your heart is rotting inside a golden cage?" For Queen Elizabeth, those tapes and letters became more than personal reminders. They were a warning, a signal that the monarchy, if it ever tried to whitewash its past, would not survive the public's memory of Diana. And so, she made the decision: those memories would belong to Charlotte. This act, while done in secrecy, reignited the most sacred question inside the palace: who owns Diana's legacy? Was it William and Harry? The sons she bore, the heirs she raised in her embrace? Was it the institution that tried to fold her into its narrative after her death, building memorials and issuing glossy documentaries to restore its image? Or was it the public, the grieving millions who lined the streets in 1997 and turned her funeral into a global reckoning? The Queen believed it belonged to none of those entirely. She believed legacy had to be embodied, and that Charlotte, young though she was, represented something Diana had always yearned for but never achieved: a life within the crown that still allowed for individual truth. By placing Diana's heirlooms with Charlotte, the Queen had ensured that the essence of what Diana stood for, heart over hierarchy, humanity over performance, would quietly travel with the next generation. Not in headlines, not in palace statements, but in small, private ways. in the locket around Charlotte's neck on her wedding day, in the ring she might wear during her first official engagement, in the bracelet she might fidget with during a moment of uncertainty, the same bracelet Diana clutched during televised interviews, unknowingly leaving a trace of herself. For Camilla, this decision carried a devastating implication. No matter how many official portraits she posed for, no matter how many charity events she led, she would never be Diana. More importantly, the Queen had drawn a line in history. Camilla was part of the royal story, but Diana was part of the soul. The press began speculating almost immediately after the revelation. Anonymous sources from within the palace leaked tidbits to favored columnists. Stories began appearing with soft, coded language. A private transfer of historical royal heirlooms has been confirmed, and young Princess Charlotte is said to be the recipient of sentimental family treasures from her late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. But among royal watchers, the subtext was obvious. Camilla, for her part, was said to be inconsolable. While she maintained her public composure, those closest to her revealed she had begun retreating from social events. During one dinner with trusted friends, she reportedly said, "Everything I've built, all the years I spent proving I belong here, and still, I'm the one left out." It wasn't the jewels, aides noted. Camilla had plenty of those. It was what they represented: inclusion, acknowledgement, lineage. To be deliberately excluded from Diana's heirlooms meant being excluded from the Queen's deeper trust. Camilla's titles had been legally cemented. Her name was in the line of succession, but her memory, in the Queen's eyes, was not worthy of inheritance. There was quiet backlash. Some in Charles's circle viewed the Queen's move as outdated, even petty. They argued it would only deepen divisions in a family already frayed by scandal, divorce, and public fatigue. And defended the Queen's decision in private. She didn't do this to punish anyone, and reportedly said, she did it to preserve something sacred. The Queen's inner circle, too, defended her choice. A retired courtier who had served under 3 monarchs said, "Her Majesty always knew that symbols matter. The ring, the diary, the tiara, they speak when we cannot. And in this case, they speak for Diana." Even William, typically cautious about palace intrigue, made quiet moves to support the decision. He was seen spending more time with Charlotte during this period, engaging in one-on-one outings, even reportedly showing her old family photo albums featuring Diana. One aide said, "He's preparing her, not for the spotlight, but for the weight that comes with it." And indeed, the weight was considerable. For Charlotte, who had only ever known her grandmother as the quiet woman in matching hats and pearls, this inheritance would eventually come with a history lesson few children her age ever receive. One day, perhaps as a teenager, she would open a leather box and find inside it a handwritten note from a woman she never met, but whose shadow still loomed across the world. And she would understand. Understand why people cried for Diana in the streets. Understand why her name could silence rooms. Understand why her story had to be remembered not with statues or stamps, but with something much more intimate. Memory passed hand to hand, piece by piece. The Queen, with her last breath of influence, had crafted that passage. Quietly, firmly. In doing so, she had not only shaped the future, she had protected the past. In the days that followed Princess Anne's revelation of the Queen's private codicil, the royal household experienced an eerie kind of calm, the kind that masks turmoil buried deep beneath surface-level smiles. The official line was unity. The unofficial reality was fracture. While William quietly supported the Queen's directive and held firm to the letter's authenticity, one member of the royal family was not just shaken, but humiliated. Camilla. The Queen Consort, as she was now formally titled, had long weathered the storm of public skepticism and historical resentment. She had learned to speak softly, to dress modestly, to remain a step behind King Charles in photographs, and to avoid commentary about Diana at all costs. It was a role crafted with care, sanded down from controversy to acceptance. But nothing, not time, not charity work, not royal titles, could have prepared her for what had just transpired. The Queen, even in death, had refused her. The sting of the snub was more than symbolic. It wasn't merely about being left out of a will. It was about being dismissed from the most sacred circle of royal trust, the intimate decisions that speak not of protocol, but of legacy. Camilla hadn't expected to receive Diana's jewels. She had long resigned herself to the idea that certain things belonged to history, not to her. But to be denied even a token? Even a handwritten letter of gratitude or an ornamented brooch once worn on Christmas Day. Nothing. The realization unfolded in quiet, devastating layers. During the gathering where and had revealed the letter, Camilla had managed to compose herself. At first, she listened. She asked for clarity. She didn't interrupt. But those in the room could see it. The tightening of her jaw, the slight tremble in her hands, the way her voice caught ever so briefly when she said, "She never truly accepted me, even in death." After she left the room, Camilla didn't speak to anyone for hours. She returned to her private suite in Clarence House, locked the door, and remained there well into the night. Only her closest aide, Angela, was allowed in. And even then, it was only to bring tea, tissues, and a woolen shawl Camilla always wore during emotional episodes. According to Angela, Camilla wept, not dramatically, but in quiet, restrained sobs that suggested exhaustion, betrayal, and a sorrow she didn't have words for. She paced the room, muttering fragments under her breath. "I gave everything. I waited years, and still she saw me as other." At one point, she reportedly said, "That woman has haunted me since the beginning. I never asked to be Diana. I only wanted to be seen as worthy. And now, she's still here, winning." The emotion behind those words was not born of jealousy. It was grief. A grief not just for what Camilla had lost, but for what she had never been allowed to claim. Despite marrying Charles, despite being crowned queen consort, despite decades of royal service, she was now faced with a cold and final reality. In the eyes of the queen, she had never truly belonged. The press, still oblivious to the full extent of the private codicil, began circling. Reporters noticed a sudden absence in Camilla's schedule. Public appearances were canceled. Private engagements postponed. A few tabloid headlines cautiously asked, "Where is the queen consort?" While others began speculating on health issues or possible disputes with King Charles. Inside the palace, Camilla was avoiding confrontation and carefully planning her next steps. She was a woman known for her discretion, not her drama. But those closest to her said the pain was different this time. This wasn't the old gossip or the recycled headlines about Diana. This was a wound dealt not by the public, but by the very crown she had worked to protect. Charles, caught between his role as monarch and husband, attempted to mediate. Sources say he spoke with and in private, asking why the queen had kept the codicil secret from him. Anne's answer was brief and immovable. "Because she knew you would try to change it." Charles didn't press further. But he also didn't defend Camilla. Not publicly, not privately, not yet. That silence, more than anything else, deepened Camilla's rage. For years, she had stood beside Charles, enduring the glances, the snide comments, the subtle exclusions. She had played the long game. She had been the shadow in Diana's wake, waiting for the moment history might forgive her. But now, even history had turned against her. Even the queen, who had smiled in photographs, toasted her at dinners, and praised her publicly, had left her out of the final, private reckoning. Camilla began reviewing the codicil on her own, and had provided a formal copy upon request, not out of obligation, but out of protocol. Camilla read it line by line, searching for nuance, for softness, for any sign that perhaps she had misunderstood. But there was none. The queen's words were clear, the intent unmistakable. Diana's legacy would be passed to Charlotte. Not just the jewels, but the voice, the letters, the history. And Camilla would be granted nothing. To those who understand the royal dynamics, this wasn't merely a snub, it was a redefining of roles. It sent a message far beyond inheritance. It suggested that no matter Camilla's current title, the queen's heart still resided with Diana. The monarchy might have moved forward. The public might have softened. But the queen had not forgotten. Camilla, in her most vulnerable moments, confided to her private circle that it wasn't the queen's decision itself that broke her. It was the pretense that had preceded it. For years, she believed she had earned the queen's acceptance. There were private lunches, handwritten birthday cards, shared laughter at Balmoral. The queen had even once remarked during a Christmas dinner, "Camilla has been a strength to Charles. We are lucky to have her." And now, it seemed, none of that had ever truly mattered. Behind closed doors, Aides debated how to respond. Some believed Camilla should issue a quiet rebuttal, perhaps through a carefully orchestrated article in one of her favored media outlets. Others urged her to remain silent, to let time dilute the sting. But Camilla made a rare decision. She would say nothing, not out of strength, but because she didn't trust herself to speak without cracking. Instead, she retreated further into the palace's private quarters, leaning on old friends, old letters, old coping mechanisms. She walked alone in the gardens. She reread personal notes from Charles written during their younger days. She turned off the television when documentaries about Diana were replayed. And she waited for the press storm to break, waited for the next royal event where she would have to stand, smile, and pretend nothing had changed. But everything had. Camilla's place in the monarchy was no longer merely ceremonial. It had become existential. She now understood that no matter how many years passed, no matter how gracefully she carried herself, she would always be walking in a legacy that did not belong to her. And with the Queen's final act, that truth was now carved into royal stone. Camilla's rage, though silent, was not fading. It was changing her, hardening her, some said, making her more guarded. Others feared it might ignite a shift in her public image, one that could fracture the uneasy peace she had maintained with William and Catherine. Because if the Queen had chosen to protect Diana's legacy with such precision, what did that mean for Camilla's own future in the story? And what, exactly, would she do about it? It's often said that Prince William carries the weight of two crowns. One is the obvious, the future king, heir to 1,000 years of monarchs, the living bridge between tradition and modernity. The other is quieter, heavier, and far more personal. It is the crown of his mother's memory, the torch he has carried for Diana since the moment her life was stolen in that Paris tunnel. To the public, William is calm, composed, and measured. He rarely speaks emotionally in public, and when he does, every word is calculated to reflect duty. But those closest to him know that his restraint is not indifference, it is discipline. Behind the stillness is a man who has never stopped grieving, never stopped remembering. And when Queen Elizabeth approached him in the final months of her life with a deeply personal question, it triggered the one instinct he had long learned to trust above all else: protect his mother. It had happened quietly, away from public scrutiny. The Queen invited William to Windsor for tea, just the two of them. It wasn't an unusual occurrence, but there was a seriousness to her tone that day. As they sat in the private garden, surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and blooming roses, she leaned in and asked, "When the time comes, how would you want your mother remembered?" William, according to a palace insider, didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the gardens, let the breeze pass, then said, "I don't want her remembered with pity. I want her remembered with dignity, with strength, with the truth." It was that moment that set into motion one of the Queen's final acts. She told William of her plan to entrust Diana's heirlooms and personal effects to Princess Charlotte, a gesture both symbolic and sacred. But before she finalized anything, she wanted to know that William was on board, that he understood the implications, that he wouldn't see it as a mere gesture, but as a responsibility. He did. In fact, he went further. He suggested specific pieces: Diana's beloved butterfly necklace, the bracelet she wore to hospital visits, her private letters to charity workers. He even mentioned the sapphire ring that Catherine now wore, and how it should one day return to Charlotte to preserve continuity, not just between queens, but between women who changed the face of royalty. The Queen listened, nodding silently. She made notes. She asked only one more question. "Do you think it will upset your father?" William hesitated, then replied, "It will. But he'll understand why." And Charles did. Eventually. But Camilla never would. William never shared the conversation with his brother, Prince Harry. The trust between the two had eroded to such an extent that even matters of legacy were now handled individually, not jointly. William knew that involving Harry, and by extension Meghan, could complicate an already fragile structure. And this was not about complications. This was about clarity. So when the Queen died, and then eventually revealed the contents of the private codicil, William stood firm. He didn't gloat. He didn't console. He simply nodded, confirming what few others in the room had known, that this had been coming. For Camilla, William's silence was deafening. There had been a time when she thought the rift between her and Diana's sons was softening. She had made gestures, invited them to lunches, written personal notes. She even attempted to build a more maternal rapport with Charlotte, albeit from a distance. But now, as the truth came out, it was clear that William had never accepted her entirely, and his support for the Queen's decision solidified that. He wasn't trying to hurt Camilla, but he was determined to protect something he believed was slipping, the unfiltered memory of his mother. Not the palace-approved version of Diana, not the charitable icon crafted for documentaries, but the woman who once cried at the foot of his bed, who danced in the kitchen, who whispered truths in a world built on performance. In Charlotte, he saw a new opportunity to preserve that memory. Charlotte was bright, observant, and in William's words, fearless in a way that reminds me of Mom. He didn't want her to be defined by Diana, but he did want her to understand the importance of her grandmother's story, not as gossip, not as tragedy, but as legacy. When he spoke to Charlotte privately about the heirlooms, in terms simple enough for her to grasp, he told her something that echoed the Queen's own words. These aren't just pretty things, darling. These are memories. They're love. They're part of who you are. Charlotte reportedly nodded, asking only, did Granny Diana wear them when she was sad? William smiled. Sometimes, and sometimes when she was strong. That's what makes them special. It was this quiet education, this transmission of emotional truth, that William saw as his real inheritance from Diana. The jewels were secondary. What mattered was the story, the intention, the memory, and he was determined to guard it, even if it meant standing at odds with Camilla or challenging his father's need for unity. In fact, insiders suggest that William had drawn a hard line behind closed doors. When discussions began about softening the impact of Anne's revelation, perhaps issuing a joint statement of support for Camilla or redirecting media attention, William refused. He said, let it stand. Mum deserves that. Some aides were startled. This was not the mild-mannered, press-conscious William they were used to. This was a son protecting his mother's last breath of truth. Catherine, ever composed, supported him. She too had seen the emotional toll Diana's legacy had taken on William, the burden of being both son and prince. And she understood what it meant to pass that story to their daughter, not as a curse, but as a compass. William knew the public would eventually learn the truth, and he welcomed it, not because it would embarrass Camilla, but because it would affirm something the palace had tried too long to suppress, that Diana still mattered, that her voice, her heart, her choices had not been in vain. As the dust settled around the revelation, William continued his royal duties without pause. But there was a renewed strength in him, a quiet pride, not for the decision made, but for the legacy preserved. He knew there would be repercussions. Camilla's demeanor had already changed. Charles had become more withdrawn. The press was hungry for stories. But William was resolute. Because for him, this wasn't about a fight. It was about a promise kept. It's one thing to be crowned. It's another to be accepted. For Camilla, the day she stood beside Charles, crowned queen consort, was meant to be the culmination of decades of effort, patience, and carefully constructed redemption. She had walked a long and thorny path, from being branded the other woman to becoming a core member of the royal household. Time, strategy, and a curated public image had softened the harsh edges of her story. And when Queen Elizabeth herself, in a rare and pointed message, gave her blessing that Camilla be known as queen consort upon Charles's ascension, it had felt like vindication. But what the Queen gave in public, she withheld in private. It was during the hours following Anne's revelation of the sealed codicil that everything changed. That was the moment, the unmistakable, heart-sinking moment, when Camilla realized she had never truly been seen as queen by the family that mattered most. Not by Elizabeth, not by William, not by Anne, and not by history. Camilla had always known there were whispers behind her back. The palace staff was too polite to speak them aloud, but the glances, the awkward silences, the murmurs after she left a room told her everything. To them, she had always been a compromise, the inevitable partner, the tolerated wife, the final chapter in a long, troubled love story. She'd learned to ignore it, learned to smile through it. But deep inside, she hoped, perhaps foolishly, that one day they would see her for who she was, loyal, devoted, enduring. That hope shattered the moment she read the Queen's words. Not cold, not cruel, but absolute. Not a mention of her. Not a token gesture. Not even a line of thanks for the decades she had spent by Charles's side. It was as if she had been erased, not publicly, where she could fight it, but privately, where it cut the deepest. And then there was the decision to give Diana's heirlooms and letters to Princess Charlotte. That, more than anything, made it clear. Diana hadn't just won the public's heart. She had secured her place in royal legacy. Through Charlotte, her story would tell. The symbolic power of the heirlooms haunted her. She couldn't stop thinking about them. The tiara, the letters, the brooches. In her mind's eye, she could see Charlotte wearing them in future portraits, newspapers dubbing her the new Diana, public affection overflowing once more for a woman long gone. And she would be watching it all happen from the sidelines. Again, Camilla's pride was wounded, but more than that, her identity had been destabilized. She wasn't just a wife. She was the queen consort, a title with weight, expectation, and meaning. But now, that title felt hollow. She held no legacy of her own. No artifacts, no lineage. Just shadows of what had been kept from her. That realization struck her hardest during a private dinner with Charles. He tried to reassure her, saying the Queen's decision didn't diminish her role, that it was more about preserving the past than attacking the present. But Camilla interrupted him, not with anger, but with exhausted truth. She didn't think I belonged, Charles. Not in life, not in memory, not even in death. Charles, visibly shaken, didn't know what to say. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away gently. The pain was too fresh. Camilla then said something that stayed with him for days. You married me, but they'll never see me as queen. Not your mother, not your son, not the people. It was raw, and it was real. The next morning, Camilla made a quiet request to her personal staff that all Diana-related press clippings be removed from her site. Old photographs, archived publications, even historical documentaries stored in the palace's private media library, all were to be removed, at least for now. It wasn't hatred. It was self-preservation. She needed space, distance, anything to keep from drowning in comparison. She also requested to delay several of her planned charity initiatives. Not permanently, just long enough to regain composure. Because the truth was, she couldn't bear the idea of smiling in front of cameras while her heart still felt the cold dismissal of a woman who was supposed to be gone. But Diana was not gone. She was now embedded in the very foundation of the monarchy's future, in Charlotte, in the Queen's final will, in the quiet reverence that still lingered around her name. And Camilla, despite all her efforts, had been placed forever outside that circle. That was the moment. The exact instant when Camilla, for all her titles and tiaras, understood a devastating truth. Being crowned meant nothing if you were never truly accepted. She would continue her role. She would attend engagements, give speeches, smile for photographs. But the part of her that once hoped for full belonging, for being embraced as queen in the eyes of those who mattered, had gone silent. And in that silence, she faced the reality she had worked so hard to deny. Diana had won, not in competition, not in bitterness, but in the way only memory can win, by being cherished. It is often said that a king must be impartial, that the crown comes before the man. But King Charles was never a man built entirely for that kind of detachment. He had always been complex, thoughtful, passionate, sometimes impulsive, and when it came to matters of the heart, he had never successfully separated emotion from duty. So when the private codicil of Queen Elizabeth's will was read aloud by Princess, and it didn't just catch Charles off guard, it shattered the fragile illusion he had spent years carefully maintaining, that his mother had finally come to accept Camilla, wholly and without condition. In that moment, seated beside his wife as she went pale with grief and disbelief, Charles felt the heavy pull of both his past and his present. He had known his mother kept private reflections, sealed instructions. That was not unusual. The Queen had always been calculated and deliberate in her legacy planning. But he had not anticipated this. To leave Camilla completely out of her personal inheritance. Not even a token gesture, not a word of grace. And instead pass on Diana's most sacred heirlooms and letters to young Princess Charlotte was something Charles had not seen coming. The symbolism was devastating. In his heart, he understood it for what it was, his mother's final and unspoken vote, not against Camilla as a woman, but for Diana as an eternal presence, one she clearly believed needed protecting, even in death. Charles said nothing in the moment, and had read the Queen's instructions with her usual cool resolve, her tone unwavering, her face unreadable. William sat still. Camilla stood and left, and Charles remained. He held the letter in his hands long after the room emptied, his eyes scanning the words that felt both familiar and foreign. The Queen's handwriting was unmistakable. He had received notes from her like this all his life. Stern, concise, unemotional, yet unmistakably hers. But this one felt colder. Not cruel, but pointed, deliberate. He did not sleep that night. He spent the early hours pacing the palace corridors, wandering through rooms once filled with the Queen's presence. He visited her private sitting room, still untouched since her passing, the scent of lavender still hanging faintly in the air, the portrait of Prince Philip still in its rightful place. And he sat, quietly, in her chair, staring out at the gardens where he had once walked with her as a boy, learning about trees and public appearances. His thoughts swirled. He didn't resent her decision, not entirely. He knew how deeply she respected tradition and symbolism. He knew she had never fully accepted Camilla, even after years of public reconciliation. But what hurt was the finality of it, the refusal to include Camilla in any small way, even as a gesture of peace. And yet, what stung even more was the clarity with which his mother had sided with Diana's memory. It reminded Charles of the years after Diana's death, the scrutiny, the backlash, the endless comparisons. How he and Camilla had to wait in the shadows, moving slowly, enduring the slow drip of public forgiveness. And when the Queen finally gave her public blessing for their union to be honored formally in the line of succession, he had believed, perhaps naively, that all wounds had been dressed, if not healed. But now he understood that the Queen had simply chosen her battles. In public, she supported the monarchy's survival. In private, she supported Diana's sanctity. This revelation placed Charles in an impossible position. As king, he could not rebuke his mother's final wishes. To do so would fracture the already delicate threads of public trust and family cohesion. He could not be seen as retaliating or rewriting her legacy. But as a husband, he was watching the woman he loved spiral into emotional turmoil, publicly humiliated and privately undone. And Charles knew Camilla. He knew how much she had sacrificed. She had endured years of being vilified, stripped of her privacy, her dignity questioned, her intentions misunderstood. She had walked through the storm with him, silently bearing the consequences of choices they had both made. She had never tried to replace Diana. She had simply tried to survive the legacy of Diana. And yet here they were, once again in the late princess's shadow, once again facing a narrative they could not control. Charles began speaking with his advisors. Carefully, quietly, he floated the idea of honoring Camilla in a new way, perhaps a newly named public charity initiative, or a commemorative event highlighting her years of service. But every suggestion felt hollow, reactive, transparent. There was no gesture grand enough to overshadow the Queen's codicil. And any overt public effort to elevate Camilla in the wake of this revelation risked backlash. The advisors were hesitant. Let it pass, one suggested. Time will absorb it. But Charles wasn't sure he could wait. Camilla was unraveling. And for the first time since his reign began, Charles felt powerless in the face of private crisis. His son, William, offered no comfort. Their relationship, already strained by years of tension over Harry, had become more distant since the will's revelation. William had not just supported the Queen's decision, he had encouraged it. Charles knew it. He could see it in his son's eyes during the reading. The quiet nod, the lack of surprise, the silent endorsement. It was as though William had drawn a circle around his mother's memory, and inside that circle, Camilla would never be welcome. And Charles? He wasn't sure which side of that line he was expected to stand on anymore. He tried speaking with William, a private meeting, father to son, hoping to find some bridge between them. But the conversation was brief, restrained, and ended with William saying only, "She made her choice, and I support it." It wasn't cruel. It was final. For days afterward, Charles retreated into himself. He canceled public appearances under the pretense of rest. Behind the palace walls, he spent more time in the royal archives than he ever had, looking at old photographs, letters from his mother, old documents that reminded him of who he had been, and what he was now expected to become. And then there was the question no one dared voice aloud. Would Camilla still be queen in the eyes of the nation? Legally, yes. Ceremonially, yes. But in the heart of public sentiment, the tide had shifted once more. The reemergence of Diana's name, attached to Charlotte in memory and innocence, had reignited an affection the palace had worked for years to manage. Camilla's position, though not threatened by law, was vulnerable to perception. Charles knew this. He felt it every time he read the papers, saw the subtle shift in headlines, the increasing praise for Charlotte's grace, for William's loyalty to his mother, for the Queen's final wisdom. And nowhere in those stories was Camilla mentioned, unless it was in reference to what she had not received. His dilemma was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. And so, in a quiet, unpublicized act, Charles visited the Queen's private chapel at Windsor. No photographers, no press, just a solitary moment between mother and son. He sat alone in the pew, the stained glass washing soft colors over the marble floor, and he whispered, I tried to make them love her, as I loved her. There was no answer, just silence. And Charles understood then, perhaps more deeply than ever, that his reign would always be divided. Between love and duty, between past and present, between a mother who could not forgive and a wife who would not forget. Princess and had long been regarded as the royal family's quiet sentinel, steadfast, unshakable, and unencumbered by the spectacle that often defined the House of Windsor. She had never chased headlines, never courted the public's adoration. Her life, in many ways, had been a study in silent endurance, doing her duty while staying several steps behind the pageantry. But when the time came to act as the voice of the late Queen, she did not falter. And when questioned about the devastating codicil, she stood firm, her words echoing not just her own truth, but the will of a monarch who had ruled for over 70 years. This was not a role Anne had sought. It was one she had inherited, not by blood, but by trust. And that distinction meant everything. The day after the family gathering where the codicil was read, the silence among the royals was stifling. Camilla had withdrawn. Charles was subdued. William was distant. But within those hushed corridors, whispers began to grow louder. Some within the royal circle questioned the timing. Others wondered whether the Queen had truly meant for her instructions to be interpreted so literally. And beneath it all was a building pressure, one that would eventually force and to break the silence. It began subtly. A few staffers in the know began circulating their discomfort. Should this information have been made public? Was it necessary? Couldn't and have waited longer, until tensions had eased? One aide, anonymous but not silent, told a friendly columnist that perhaps the Princess Royal had acted too swiftly. Within hours, those words had made their way into the press, disguised behind veiled language. Senior sources questioned timing of legacy revelations. And heard about it the same evening. She didn't rage. She didn't call for retractions. Instead, she invited a select group of her most trusted press advisors into a quiet salon in St. James's Palace, sat them down with a cup of black tea, and laid the letter on the table. This, she said, is Mother's will. Her true will. One of the advisors cautiously asked if and wanted to issue a formal statement. She shook her head. No, but I will not stand by while her judgment is questioned. It was Anne's style, measured, direct, without flourish. She didn't need theatrics. She had the truth. That night, she made a decision that would ripple through royal watchers and insiders alike. She authorized a discreet but direct interview with a reputable publication known for its decorum and royal loyalty. No camera crews. No dramatic headlines. Just words. In that rare interview, conducted behind closed doors and with minimal editing, and explained the Queen's decision and her own role in revealing it. She gave it to me because she knew I would not flinch, and said, she knew I would not politicize it, I would not hide it, and I would not distort it. When she handed me that envelope, she said, use this only when truth needs a shield. The interviewer asked whether and believed her mother intended to hurt Camilla. Anne's response was immediate. No, but she intended to protect Diana's memory. That was her duty as queen, not just to the living, but to the history that defines us. She went on to say that the Queen understood the fragile balance of legacy within the royal family. That giving Charlotte Diana's heirlooms wasn't about punishing Camilla, but about ensuring the monarchy never forgot the woman who had shaped and shaken it forever. She waited because she knew this day would come, and said plainly, the day Camilla tried to claim what was never truly hers. Those words struck like a thunderclap, not because they were angry, but because they were definitive, and wasn't speculating. She wasn't attacking. She was executing her mother's last instruction with the same quiet discipline she had carried her entire life. The reaction was swift. Within hours, online forums exploded. Royal commentators dissected every phrase. Some praised Anne for her loyalty to the Queen's vision. Others criticized her for being unnecessarily harsh. But one truth became clear, and had drawn a line, and she had drawn it publicly. She had made it known that Queen Elizabeth's will, sealed, personal, deliberate, was not to be questioned. Inside the palace, her decision caused tension. Charles, still reeling from Camilla's emotional descent, called his sister privately. Their conversation was brief, tense. He asked her, with restrained formality, whether the public statement had been necessary, and reportedly replied, she didn't raise us to cower, Charles. If you want her remembered as a monarch who bent for the sake of convenience, that's your business. But I will remember her as a woman who stood for what mattered. There was a pause on the line, then and hung up. For William, Anne's words were affirming. In the days that followed, he reached out to her more than once, expressing quiet gratitude. You said what I couldn't, he reportedly told her during a walk in the gardens at Windsor. And you reminded people who she really was. And, as always, brushed away the compliment. I said what she told me to say, nothing more. But her words had done more than deliver the Queen's last wish. They had reframed the public conversation. The narrative shifted from palace drama to royal resolve. Anne's voice lent the Queen's posthumous decision a weight it had previously lacked. It no longer felt like an emotional maneuver. It felt like history being protected from erosion. In the days that followed, Camilla's public appearances resumed, but with a visible edge. Her composure returned, but her smile had changed. And her circle grew tighter, more cautious. She knew the Queen's verdict could not be undone, and had ensured it could not be ignored. As for Anne, she returned to her regular schedule without pause. Horse trials, military inspections, briefings. She did not speak further on the matter. She didn't need to, because the point of her words wasn't to open wounds. It was to close a chapter with dignity. She had always been her mother's daughter, unsentimental, dutiful, sharp-edged but loyal. And when the moment came to carry out her most sacred task, she did so without hesitation. This was Mother's will, she had said. And now, it was everyone's to remember. There are secrets in every palace, but some are buried deeper than others. Beneath Windsor Castle, beneath the stone corridors and gilded halls, beyond the public archives and ceremonial chambers, there exists a vault not listed on any official blueprint. Few knew of its existence. Fewer still knew what was kept inside. It wasn't gold. It wasn't diamonds. It wasn't state secrets. It was memory. And inside that private, double-locked vault, which required both the Queen's personal key and a handwritten code only known to Princess Anne, lay the most carefully guarded collection in the modern history of the royal family, Diana's private legacy. Not the one that belonged to the state. Not the one memorialized in bronze. But the one that had been left behind in whispers, scribbles, and the soft scent of a mother's perfume. After Queen Elizabeth's death and Anne's subsequent release of the codicil, the time had come to access the vault. It wasn't done with fanfare. There were no photographers, no ceremonial unlocking. Just Anne, alone, descending the private stairwell behind the Queen's personal library, a staircase most believed was nothing more than a cleaning passage. At the bottom, a thick iron door stood behind an unassuming wooden panel. It bore no crest, no signage, no visible lock. But Anne knew exactly what to do. She pulled out the key, inserted it into the hidden seam along the doorframe, and turned until the mechanism clicked once, then again. The sound echoed into silence. The door swung open slowly, revealing a room that felt more like a shrine than a vault. There were no fluorescent lights, only warm lamps with silk covers, placed thoughtfully across the room. A heavy velvet curtain hung in the far corner, concealing the oldest materials. Everything had been arranged with extraordinary care. And stepped inside, and for a moment, simply stood there. Before her, On antique wooden shelves and inside glass cabinets were the pieces of Diana's life the world never saw. Not the dresses on display in museums, not the sound bites or televised interviews. These were her private thoughts, her real story, left in the care of the only woman in the family the Queen believed would preserve it without altering it.